Good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 4 of the Grognard Grumbles. I am your host with the most, Cody Broussard, and I am once again joined by my illustrious co-hosts, Chase Green and Dave Ferguson. And tonight we have a special guest from my home city, Music City, USA, Joe Collins. Joe, say hello.
Howdy, boys.
How's everybody else doing tonight?
Doing great. Glad to be back.
Doing good.
Right on. As usual, I like, anytime I have a special guest on, I like the special guest to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their experience in gaming and when they got started and anything else they'd like to tell us about themselves. Joe Collins, when did you get started in gaming?
Wow, a long time ago, guys. It's pretty interesting being considered a grognard. I think when you start out, you don't think of yourself as that, but look back over the years, and I was kind of there at the beginning of all this stuff. Born and raised in Chattanooga, and so I grew up in the '60s. I always loved games, board games of all kinds. Anything from your simple mousetrap when I was a little kid. I think everybody remembers that.
Oh, yeah.
And to a little more sophisticated games. And somewhere in the late '60s, I had a friend who had a bunch of board games, and he had this game called Broadside.
Was that like a hex and shit kind of game, or?
No, it was actually Milton Bradley. It was had plastic ships, and
Okay.
and the problem was that one side was missing. And so we saw this. It was the coolest thing I ever saw. I was like, I want to play this. I was probably 8 years old, 9 years. This was like 68, 69, right at
Gotcha.
that time period. Maybe even younger than that. But there were a bunch of these games they'd put out. There actually ended up being 5 different ones. And so I bugged my dad to get the game because I thought it was really cool looking. And that Christmas, evidently they'd sold out of that, but they had another one, which was called Dogfight. And you had the basically World War One. You had Germans versus the American/British Allies, and there were cards and that you turned over, and you move these planes on a square grid, and it was really cool. And I loved it. Dad would play it with me. He liked it, and I always wanted some of the other games in that series, but you could never
Right.
find them in Chattanooga. And
Who made those?
it's all Milton Bradley.
Okay, that was Milton Bradley too, huh?
Yeah, there was. I
Yeah.
think the first one was as like Broadsides, and there was one Hit the Beach,
Right.
which was a kind of a World War II one, and then there was Battle Cry. Not the Borg Richard Borg game, but
Right.
this was the original one, and much later there was Skirmish, which was American Revolution. That one was probably 75, 78. That one came out. That was one of the last ones. So anyway, really thought that game was cool. There weren't at that time any other war games that I was exposed to. And of course, this was before role playing
Right.
had come about. And so went on, got into high school, went to the Baylor School in Chattanooga, which was a just dropped military. So
Yeah.
it was still 7th grade. It was still military, somewhat, and very regimented, very little free time.
Right.
8th grade, though, that eased up. And so we had basically one during the day. We had this one period that was for clubs and hobbies and stuff like that. And all the teachers sponsored a club or hobby, and they had a chess club. And I was like, well, I knew how to play chess.
Yeah.
Kind of taught myself, and let's see if I'm any good at it. And teacher there, a guy named David Harris, just retired a couple of years ago. Great teacher, one of the funniest natural comedians you've ever met, and a great history teacher as well. He was in charge of the chess club.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, I'll try chess. And so I played some of the games, and I did pretty well in the club against the guys in my own grade, the 8th graders, and played some of the guys in the upper school, and just got walloped.
Right.
And what I found come to find out in chess is that you need to study the opening moves and everything else. And so I went to the library and got books on chess and opened it up and started looking at the opening moves. And I was like, holy crud, this is not for me.
Right.
Yeah, I was just like, I don't want to learn 27 opening moves of the French defense and all this stuff. And so I went back to David Harris, the teacher, and I was like, this is cool, but I'm really, really not that interested.
Yeah.
And he said, well, we got a new club that just opened up. It's another teacher in the history department, and it's a war games club. And I was like, what the hell's a war game?
Yeah.
And he goes, well, this guy is his Dr. John McBride. And I was like, okay. And he's the American history teacher, and you'll have him in a couple of years. And I was like, okay. So I went, and John was he was new at the Baylor School. It was his first or second year there, and met him, and he did a thing with war games. And here were these really cool hex maps. With counters, it seemed like hundreds of counters at the time, and these really intense rules that were all categorized and everything you had to read through. And I was like, all right, I'll try this. This looks really cool. And that was the start of it. And of course, I don't know, you guys may not know, John comes to NashCon. His son, David, owns Splinter Light Miniatures, which is makes some of the finest fantasy 15 millimeter miniatures for role playing and miniature gaming. So that's David McBride.
I would definitely plug Splinter Light. They make, if you're into 15 millimeter, they make some of the best. Fantastic fantasy and science fiction and modern day. I think they have some ancients and medieval too. Really good range.
The historical line's great too. Both the fantasy and historical line are great. So so that's Dr. John McBride. Of course, John's got a couple of published rule sets out now. He's got his fantasy rules, the Pride of Lions, and he's got and he's got another one based on the Mexican-American War, and a historical set. So anyway, so John kind of got me into the Wargaming Club, and while I was there, one of the opening things was not just the board games, but they had miniatures as well.
Right.
And there was an upperclassman there, James Gentry, and Jamie was a junior, and didn't really want to talk to eighth grader, but I wanted to play, and he goes, okay, I'll play. And so we played our first Napoleonic miniature game. And the rules we used was this funny red, white, and blue rule book, and it was by this guy with a really weird last name. I'd never seen the last name before. It was Gygax. And and so I was like, well, that's interesting. And so I enjoyed playing that. And of course, we all know Jamie. Well, not we all, but Jamie Gentry from coming to NashCon every year. So that's how I got started into gaming. I guess that was eighth grade year, so 74, 75. Later that year.
That's kind of interesting because I kind of had that's almost how I kind of got started in gaming, even though I don't usually bring that up. I usually start with my role-playing experience, but my dad played a lot of those games in the 70s. And growing up, he was really into games. And so me and him would play chess. And eventually he introduced me to Jutland and Gettysburg. We played all these old Avalon Hill games. And in middle school, I kind of had the similar experience they started a chess club. Well, there were only two of us in the whole school that knew how to play chess, me and another guy who, ironically, we used to play war games with each other because he was in a military family, and he was really into military history and stuff, and as was I, so we used to talk about that and play war games. And so we got into the chess club and just walloped everybody. And so we were like, okay, well, this is kind of boring. So the next week I brought some of the old Avalon Hill games and Axis and Allies. And so we basically turned the chess club into a war games club. And then that slowly evolved into also role-playing games. Anyways, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It just was very kind of similar experience and story.
But that's very cool. That is very cool. Yeah. So the big start of this, was the Hex and Counter war games. Later that year, John had a new game he'd ordered, seen it in the catalog, I guess, and brought it to the club. And we had all read Lord of the Rings at that time.
Right.
And I was really big. I'd really been big in some of the pulp genre. I read all the Doc Savage books, which I think kids back that a lot of us did at that time,
Yeah.
and which are really really horrible writing, but they're fun as hell.
Yeah.
And John had introduced me to Robert E. Howard, and so I'd read all the Conan stories.
Right.
And so I thought that was very cool. And this new game, basically allowed you, he said, to play out these stories. And I was like, cool. And so it was this white box. I think it was his third or fourth printing of D&D. And so I said, okay, well, I'll give it a try.
What year was this?
Gosh, 75?
So it was
76?
It wasn't too long after it came out.
No.
Yeah.
If I remember, the Greyhawk first supplement Greyhawk was out, but I think that was maybe Blackmore, maybe the second one was out as well.
Okay.
We didn't have either one of those starting out.
Right.
We just had the original box.
Yeah.
And I think that the original box that John had still had all the Tolkien stuff in it. They hadn't been sued yet and forced to take it all out.
Right. So it was early on, yeah.
Yeah, it was very early on. So I got the rules and I read them, and I was really excited. And I thought this was really cool. All my buds, all my friends had about 6 of us that thought this was a really cool game, but we couldn't really figure it out. You seem to have the chainmail rule set, and for some reason we didn't have that at that time.
Yeah.
And so we just kind of winged it.
So you guys really couldn't make heads or tails of it? I'm kind of interested because haven't heard too many people that, because you come from that generation that started with wargaming, going into role playing games, and nowadays most people don't have that experience. So it's really interesting to me to hear an old wargamer going into this totally new concept, role playing games. How did you guys treat that? How did you go into that? Could you make heads or tails of what the concept of the game was? Because the white box, let's be real, it's pretty confusing, right? It's not laid out the best. It doesn't really give clear explanations of what's happening.
Yeah, the getting the gist of it was no problem at all. I mean, we understood what you were to do with this. We were upset because the mechanics weren't all there, and so I was like, well, crud, I don't have this. All you have to use is a stupid alternate combat system, which looked stupid to me. I was like, okay, so we'll use that. And of course, we didn't have 20-sided dice. There were no dice anywhere. So we did basically chit pulls out of a cup.
Oh, yeah. That's
so
hilarious.
I drew up a 6-level dungeon, which was way too big, and had all my buddies over to spend the night, and we spent 24 hours, I think, straight playing D&D for the first time.
Holy shit!
And, the way it's supposed to be.
It really it was cool. It was really cool. And then after that, my good buddy Rick McGee. By the way, if you guys are ever in the Raleigh-Durham area, he owns Foundation Edge Bookstore, and to this day. And so Rick kind of took over the DMing role, and we were off to the races doing role-playing games. Still playing a lot of the simulation publication SPI, incorporated their and the Avalon Hill board games as well. And so that's kind of my start in the whole thing, and it was very early. Seeing it all come about was pretty interesting over the years.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious, just to rewind a little bit. You were talking about a Napoleonic rule set that Gygax wrote. I'm not familiar with that one. What do you remember off the top of your head what that is?
I think it's called Tricolor.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, and I hope I'm not misspeaking that, but I'm pretty sure it was Gygax that he wrote that one, and then there was an English Civil War set that we
Yeah.
had,
Yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
which was uh, Cavaliers and Roundheads, I think was the name of it. And there seems like there was one other game that he, besides Chainmail, that miniatures
Right.
game that he authored. But yeah, I'm pretty sure he was the author of Tricolor. Have to look that up, but that sticks in my mind. That's the first time I saw that name. It may be the Cavaliers and Roundheads the first time that I saw that, because we had those rules as well.
Yeah, just checking out the Wikipedia page for Tricolor. So it was published by TSR in 1975. It was written by Rick Crane, and
Oh, Rick.
I guess he became a wargaming associate of Gary Gygax.
Okay, yeah, I maybe I misremember that Gygax was the author of that. I may have gotten that confused with the Cavaliers and Roundheads, which I think he was one of the authors of that, as well as Chainmail.
Very cool.
Yeah, but TSR, that's right, TSR published it. So
Absolutely. So Gygax, I mean, he definitely was part of it.
Yeah.
So you guys were playing with the white box. Where did you go from there? Did you move into AD&D when it came out?
Yeah, we did white box for quite a while. We got all the supplements. Greyhawk was pretty huge.
Right.
And Blackmore disappointing, and then
Yeah.
even though we did the adventure in there, the Temple of the Frog, we did play that.
Oh, yeah.
Which was fun. And Eldritch Wizardry again was just kind of
Yeah.
There was the original Gods, Demigods, and Heroes, which blatantly just ripped off lots of people's intellectual property rights. It was awesome.
Yeah.
We like that, and so we ran with that. When AD&D came out, I forget. It's like the Monster Manual was like 78 or 79.
79.
Yeah, we got that, and then the Player's Manual seemed to be much later. Maybe it wasn't until 80. I think I was a senior that year, and so we pretty much stuck with the old white box. We used some of the stuff from AD&D, and after that, I was off to college, and kind of the role playing came to an end at that time.
Oh, it did.
Yeah, there wasn't. I went to school here at Vanderbilt, and there was
Right.
not a lot of role playing at Vanderbilt. Did a Traveler campaign when I was there, and
So were you still wargaming in college?
again, there wasn't
Yeah.
much. Yeah, we played a couple of Avalon Hill board games and other things, and pretty much gaming came to an end there for about 4 years. And it was not a big thing at Vanderbilt at that time, and there was no game store. Well, there may have been one game store here in Nashville. There was something over in Green Hills that sold Avalon Hill games, and there may have been one other store that had a few things, but pretty much it was 4 years in the wasteland.
Gotcha. So I'm guessing after you got out of, were you still interested in it when you were in college?
Yeah, very much. I would still go home, and in the summers we did a little bit of role playing. My buddy Rick McGee would DM on occasion, and then I'd see John McBride and go over to my old high school and see him. We'd play a game or two during the summer, and he got me interested in ancients, doing 15 millimeter and 25 millimeter ancients, and so I really enjoyed that, but I just couldn't buy 300 and paint 300 figures at that time. That wasn't happening, and so that's all the gaming I had was basically in the summer, and usually just maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times each summer.
Yeah. So going back to the white box, or just the early D&D years for you, I've always been kind of curious, since it was wargamers that really took hold of this thing to begin with. It seems like to me, it was the wargamers that were the initial crowd, and then it kind of moved into the universities. did the wargaming crowd seem to take onto it really quickly, or was there any animosity towards it, or were there people that just couldn't accept it at that time?
You read about
Right.
that in some of the magazines, and it was interesting. It's not like today with the internet. The magazines were kind of the what created the shared
Yeah.
culture back then, and you had the Simulations Publication Incorporated
Yep.
(SPI), which is Jim Dunnigan's firm out of New York, which produced tons of games, and they had their Strategy and Tactics magazine and Moves magazine, and you had a pretty good write up in both, some panning D&D, and then some saying, it was a very interesting, very cool
Right.
game. And so there was kind of a split there. At the club in high school, it wasn't that big of a, everybody would say, oh yeah, okay, we can play D&D. Some people didn't like it as
Mhm.
much. And preferred the more historical games. But there was never really for us any big split or very any large animosity between the two different crews. We were all very much one cohesive club, and we kind of did. Everybody did what they wanted to do, but you kind of bounce back and forth between the two. So we didn't see a real. In fact, we were looking for ways to integrate the two. Um, we wanted to do our role playing, and we came to a point in the story where there was a big battle. We wanted to have a set of rules that we could do and play the battle
Right.
out on
Yep.
cardboard. We didn't really have the miniatures at that time, and so we wanted that, and we were always looking for the great medieval / fantasy board game that would allow us to do that, and then jump back into role playing after the battle was over. And however that took the
Yeah.
story.
I think
And so we
you're talking up Dave's alley here. Dave definitely loves the idea of that sort of thing, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, just listening to the way you talk about it, Joe. I mean, like this is the way the game was meant to be played. As much every time we read about it or look at the old white books, the white box, brown box. I mean, there's so many people, who had mentioned, you walk around, you adventure, you find things. There's that chance there and layer, and then break out the battle mat and let's go at it.
Yeah, we looked at it that way, and we wanted to build, also wanted to build kingdoms and be parts of major battles, and so we kind of integrated all of that, and wanted to integrate all that. And the main aspect, is still the individual, role playing, small level adventuring, but we wanted to integrate all that together. So there's never the answer to your question, long answer to
Yeah.
short question. The answer is really no. The animosity we were always kind of amused
Right.
by, and it was mainly just in the magazines of somebody gruffing,
Yeah, yeah.
there shouldn't be any role playing here, or whatever.
Right. From the previous generation of grognards, right?
Yeah, even though we don't wonder, we think, I think back, and everybody seems so much older than me,
Yeah.
and I was like, here's John McBride, our faculty advisor, and he seemed like, the adult in the room, and he was probably, 26, 27 years old,
Right. Yeah.
and we were all
Yeah.
16. So, yeah.
Yeah, so did, when you got introduced to the concept of role playing and still being a wargamer, did you did you take any of those role playing elements and import them into your war game?
No, not
Yeah.
really. I think it was kind of the other way around. We wanted to get hyper realistic, whatever that
Right.
meant, in the role playing, and we were used to fairly complicated games. And the original D&D was very complicated. There's lots of stuff to it,
Mhm.
and there's no unified systems, and we wanted to even make it more so, because that was just kind of the way things were going. And so we actually wanted to pull all sorts of mechanics in. And I guess my junior year, there was a set of role playing. We were looking at other role playing rules at that time. I got the original
Yep.
RuneQuest, with Greg Stafford's, and actually at the White Bear Red Moon board game, which I still have somewhere, which was very
Yeah.
cool. and just looking at that was like, wow, it evoked all sorts of really cool ideas. And there was another set called Chivalry and Sorcery, which has just been
Oh yeah.
republished.
Yeah.
It came out, and it was like 12 times as complicated as D&D. And I was like, oh, this is so
Yeah.
cool, and read through it and everything else. You could study it for months, and I began to slowly realize it was completely and totally unplayable.
Right.
Um,
Did you ever latch on?
so
Did you ever latch on to Rollmaster?
towards I don't think that came out till maybe my senior year. It was like Arms Law, I think was the name
Right.
of it. And my buddy Rick got it, and it wasn't it was just like a replacement combat system, I think, at that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
And we monkeyed around with it, but it was, at that time, I think I'd finally begun to realize this was like so complicated. The Chivalry and Sorcery was like straight
Oh, yeah.
out. And even the roll master was like, whoa.
Oh, yeah.
And so we'll just stick with D&D.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because at that time, you know, games, games from the 60s and 70s are moderate complexity, I'd say. But towards the end of the 70s, into the 80s, everybody wanted complications, and the complexity level went way up. But it's kind of interesting because that's kind of died down through the years, and now we're getting back to the basics and really simplistic games. That's what everybody wants: quick, fast, simplistic. And the com- complex games have kind of gone out the window, which I think is kind of unfortunate because as much as I do love simple games, I'd still like to play some of those. Every once in a while, you want some meat and potatoes. And it doesn't seem like people. I don't know if they don't have the attention span for it, or if people maybe they think people don't have the attention span for it, but
Well, it's also a matter of there's less. It's easier to jump into a game with simpler rules. You spend less time at character creation. You get more
yeah, I
time
don't
playing.
disagree with that. But sometimes I kind of like every once in a while I kind of like some number crunching and some complexity. Not all the time, not all the time, but every once in a while, I kind of in the mood for that type of game, and there's really not that many options for those type of games anymore. And I don't know if that's a bad thing or not. It's just an observation, really. I don't know if anybody.
Well, I think there was sort of a megalomania that hit in the late 70s, early 80s, that everything was bigger and more complicated meant it was
Right.
better. And in some instances it
Mhm.
was, in some instances it wasn't. It really depended on the game and the thinking behind it, and what the game thought was important. The You saw that in the board gaming, saw it in miniatures gaming, and you also saw it in role
Yep.
playing. I think what the Chivalry and Sorcery was, like I said, completely over the top. I mean, brilliant. The guy, I forget the guy's name who did it. He's still around, I think. Obviously a brilliant fellow, but it got to the point that it wasn't
Right.
playable. On the other hand, you looked at RuneQuest by Greg
Yep.
Stafford, which was very complex, but was very
Oh, yeah.
playable
Yeah.
with the open. I forget what they call it now. The D100 system
Open-ended
that
roles
they
and
have.
yeah, a very, very good system. I think it highly underrated even to this day. RuneQuest doesn't get talked about enough. It still is really good system. I mean, they've updated it, and it definitely has its fan base still, I think, because they still have editions coming out, and they keep updating it. It gets resurrected from the dead every once in a while, every few years. But it's a good one.
Yeah, and it was the basis for Call of
Yeah,
Cthulhu,
yeah.
and the the ones based on Michael Moorcock's writing, Stormbringer and Hawkmoon was the other one that they used that system for, or various parts of that system. That's example one that's more complicated, but worked really
Right.
well. So you kind of get that. It's not even a balance. It's I guess kind of how bright the person was who came up with the concept. And it's interesting too. You see these reprints. A very simple system that just got reprinted, kind of on the other side, was the Fantasy
Oh, yeah.
Trip. And I don't know if you
Absolutely.
guys, yeah, if you guys, I remember when it was just the board game Melee metagaming. Was the name of the company, and came out $2.95, and I actually mailed off in the envelope $2.95 to the company to order it, mail order, which is pretty funny. And and got it and played. And of course, it got turned into full fledged role playing system. And now after 40 years, Steve Jackson has reprinted it, and it's very cool and a fun game. Well, after college. I had a little bit more time and a little bit more money, and I was no longer had the space to do uh, uh, the big board games, the SPI games that I wanted to do. And most of my friends had moved off; they were other places, and so I didn't really have my role playing group anymore. And so I was kind of at a loss as what to do, and I decided, well, I want to do these miniatures. I always wanted to do them. So I bought my mom is an artist, and so she had some paints and stuff that I could steal, and so I went and I
Oh, yeah.
ordered a bunch of minifigs. And and then I was still in Chattanooga, and John McBride was still teaching at their school at that time, and so I he kind of helped get me started painting an army, and so I started in my career in painting and building miniature armies,
Which
and
is kind of
so
gotten out of
he and
control
I
at this point, I
played.
think.
Yeah, it's
I've been in
completely
Joe's
out of
basement. I
control.
can attest to it.
Yeah, yeah, that's scary. So I started the War Games Research Group,
Right.
WRG, Ancients Rules, and because those were kind of the main,
Yep.
by a guy named Phil Barker, and Phil's rules were internationally used, and John liked them, and so I started playing those, and they were competitions, which was amazing. In fact, NashCon had a WRG Ancients competition, and so the first 2 years that I came up here, that I didn't live here, I still in Chattanooga. First 2 years of NashCon, I think the first one they had 40 or maybe 36, I think,
Oh,
players
wow.
in the ancient competition, which was just like
Holy shit.
awesome. Yeah, I mean, it was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I was blown away, and so I played there, and then I continued building my ancient armies, and played the next year, and then the third year I actually had moved. By then, it was early '90s. I'd moved to Nashville, and started World War II when I moved here, and building World War II miniatures armies, and the rest is history, from World War II to Napoleonics, to it just goes on and on.
And was this so when you came back to Nashville, was this around the time you, hooked up with the Track and Hole guys?
Yeah. I had there was a club in Chattanooga, and at the Royal Tiger Hobby
Yeah.
Shop, Tim Lee, I mentioned before, and we done some miniatures there. And I was just getting going with all that there, and we had a couple of guys from Nashville. Major Bill Harding came down and introduced himself, and yeah, he was at told us about that there was a hobby shop um, that had opened up in Nashville. And then we found out about NashCon, and found out the guys at Games Extraordinaire were the guys doing NashCon. And I was like, okay, very cool. And so when I moved up here, first thing I did is look them up. Went there on a Tuesday night, and met the guys there. And they were all doing World War II micro armor, 6mm World War II, and so that's what I got going with, and met all the guys there. It turned into the Track and Hall Club, and that was 30 over
Which is still going
about 30
today.
years ago. So, which is still going today. Some of your Kirk Harris and I are two of the original members. Doc Dave came in a little bit later. I'm not sure Nathan had even been born.
So there's other people
time.
listening here that aren't familiar with what we're talking about. The Track and Hole Club is our local war games club here in Nashville, Tennessee. Anybody is welcome to drop by. We play every Tuesday night around 6:00 at the Game Keep. Just Google the Game Keep. Drop by on a Tuesday night, and we'll usually be there playing games. And yeah, if anybody from out of town stops through Nashville, please stop on by the Track and Hole Club. They're a great group of guys. You couldn't find a better group of old grognards that like to bullshit and game. Friendliest guys, friendliest gamers you'll ever meet. But anyways, yeah, I just wanted to plug the club a little bit there and give people some reference point what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, it's a great group of guys who've been around for 30 years, and we do everything from mainly miniatures, but we also do role playing. We just finished up a huge Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition campaign, and now we're doing some other things. So anyway, it's been a great group over the years. So anyway, that's kind of how the miniatures came about. I continued my role playing at the time through I kind of missed second edition of D&D. Just that one kind of went by the wayside. Got into third edition a bit, but again, I kind of hit the wall. That was so complicated, especially when you got to the higher levels. It became a bit of a drag. Fourth edition was amusing, but never really clicked with me. And now fifth edition has kind of turned back the clock a bit. I prefer it over the others. I still prefer the original OD&D or AD&D.
So did you you were talking about how you kind of tuned out during second edition? Did you just stop role playing altogether during that time, or you just had your first edition stuff and that was good enough, or what?
Yeah, pretty much had stopped by then. What had happened is I just started the miniatures, and so that bit me pretty good, and so put pretty much all of my energy into that. And At that time, and the second edition, while it was interesting, I was a little bit older by that time. My peer group had kind of they'd like I said, moved out of Chattanooga, and when I moved here to Nashville was a little bit later. So there was a younger group playing the second edition, and I don't know, it didn't really click. And like I said, I'd bit pretty big in the miniatures, and so I was doing miniatures at that time.
So what kind of drew you back into role playing? Yeah.
Well, I always liked it. Always wanted to do it, and when the first computer games came out that were based on AD&D, I bought those. Yeah, the Gold Box series, and I thought they were great, and I had a lot of fun with them. And then and so that kind of got the spark back, and from then on, it was just a point of finding the right people and getting back into it.
What was your favorite Gold Box game?
I really think that the very first one, in some ways, that captured my imagination as being the very best. And you would think that wouldn't be the case, because at one time I was playing it on a machine. I'm not even sure it had a hard drive. I think it was on floppy disks. And so there would be like in the middle of an action, something would be happening, and you'd have to this screen would pop up and say, you have to put disk X in. You have to pop disk X in. And you sit there for 30 seconds as it read the disk, and then the action would start again on the screen. But the first one was it really captured my God, I forget the name of it now. We were in the town having to clear blocks out of the town in order to save the town. What was the name of that? God, I can't say it right now.
I only had one of the old Gold Backs. I mean, I still had I had the Bard's Tale, but my favorite gold box was Champions of Krynn. It was like the first in the Dragonlance series. Oh my god, I played
Yeah,
that.
that was like the fourth one. That's like the fourth one that came out. Yeah, there was like three prequel. There were like three of the originals, and then the game engine got better because basically everybody started could afford machines with hard drives at that time. And yeah, and so they kept upping the game engine, the graphics and all kept getting better. And so yeah, that one was good. Somewhere along in there, they came out with the first one, which was kind of like first person, and I didn't like it. I liked the overhead
Yeah, Eye of the
control
Beholder and those. Yeah, yeah,
version. Yeah, Eye of the Beholder. Yeah, that was the first like first person. That didn't click with me, but the earlier gold box ones,
they are.
yeah, they
I
were
still
way
love those
cool.
games and still play them. Actually, they're probably my favorite D&D computer games next to Baldur's Gate. I think those are comparable, but I still kind of like the gold box games because they feel like a more authentic D&D experience. It really felt like you were playing through a real old school D&D adventure.
Yeah, it was they were pretty well structured too.
Yeah, they were, and the other cool part about them is anybody that's never played them before is they they were a campaign. So if you finished the first game, you could take your characters, put them into the second game, and you could keep going. And the third game, and I think there were 4 games in that initial series, if I'm not mistaken. And then they
I don't
had
remember. Yeah, the Krynn series did that. I had some buddies that had all three of the games in that one, and they would do that. Like they'd play through one, and then have their characters all decked out with cool gear, and then load up those characters into the second one. It was really neat.
yeah, yeah, and then they had the Dragonlance games, which were the same thing. And nowadays, people still love those games, and there is go out there and look. There's thousands of fan made campaigns and adventures now. And so you can create a party of characters and you can play through all these classic modules and stuff. And it's really awesome. Even to this day, I think it's still one of the best D&D computer game engines ever made. It's just fantastic.
It was certainly brilliant for its time. And then after that,
Yeah.
you mentioned the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale. Both were I got those and played through those. Baldur's Gate being superior for, in some ways, incredibly ahead of its time as far as the character interaction with the NPCs. Icewind
Oh
Dale
yeah.
didn't have that, even though Icewind Dale, the graphics and story were really cool too. So played through both of those, and so that kept my role playing interests. Um, and until finally I settled this in the last 10 years, really settled into playing here with the Track and Hall Club, got them interested in playing it. So it's kind of the rundown of the whole RPG thing. But as you're mentioning, Cody, the roots really were in the early wargaming, and of course, that's how Gary Gygax got his start
Yeah.
in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. And you see the roots of that going through the original D&D, and it's pretty interesting how all that came together.
It is, and this was is going to kind of be our main topic tonight. And I guess we're kind of beating around the bush, getting into this. Basically, the roots of role playing games, which is wargaming. And I don't think there's a lot of division still amongst the community, even though there's some crossover too. There's guys like me and Joe and some other guys that are equally passionate about both. But there's plenty on both sides that kind of just stick with one side or the other and don't even look into what the other side's all about. And I think that's a shame because they're so intertwined. I think people really need to observe if you're a role player and you've never played a war game, you need to go do some war gaming. And if you're a war gamer and never role played, you need to go do some role playing at least once. Give it a try. You might find something there you like. But I think most people listening to this podcast are probably role players because that's mainly what we've been touching on, and mainly the people we've been talking to are mainly role players. And that's one reason I want to have Joe on tonight because he's a war gamer, but also a role player, and transitioned right from the beginning, right from the start.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so the history of wargaming, I guess we should go into that a little bit, and I'll let Joe kind of start it off. He probably knows, even though I mean, I've read a lot about it, but Joe was there and Joe saw it, and he probably has a lot more information on it, little tidbits than I do. And uh, Joe, take us back to like the beginning of war games and where that really all began.
Yeah, I mean, everybody I think is well, maybe not realizes that a lot of your early wargaming was done by the military.
Yep.
And got taken over fairly quickly in by civilians. And the military aspect was taken and kind of made into a gaming aspect. H.G. Wells' Little Wars. He wrote and doing games with miniatures figures, but they were the beginnings of war games. There's another guy named Fletcher Pratt who worked with the U.S. Navy,
Yep.
who came up with a set of naval rules. It was a book he published. And he actually had people playing in his ballroom
Yeah.
with wooden ships on the floor. They would actually move them on a big ballroom floor and doing a ship on ship battles. And so all that came together with traditional gaming back in the late '60s. And you had Avalon Hill Corporation actually come up with the first hex chit and hex games. And
Which were huge at the time.
yeah,
You know,
they were
I
very
don't think a lot of people realize how big Avalon Hill was when they first came around. It was
yeah.
huge.
You had a lot of things going on at that time. You had a lot of a lot of folks coming out of World War II
Mhm.
who were in their 30s and 40s and 50s at that time, who had some interest in that. You had a lot of people coming out of you had the Vietnam era. You had the big NATO Warsaw Pact standoff.
Yeah.
And so there were a lot of tensions, but also in the United States, you had, for the first time, people were very wealthy. There was a huge middle class, an educated middle class, and so the main outlet that people had for entertainment had become the TV.
Right.
And it's my theory that that's a very one-sided medium. You're being
Yep.
fed
Yep.
stuff, and so the what people were looking for, I think, was the idea of producing a narrative, producing a story.
Yeah.
And these games were a good way to do that with history. You could make your own history. You could produce your own story, and you weren't just sitting there absorbing it. You were actually doing it. You were refighting, the Montgomery's, campaigns in the desert, or Rommel, or Patton breaking out from Normandy, or Caesar fighting at the Gauls, and you were doing it. It wasn't You weren't passive; you were active in it, and
Right.
so it produced a story, a storyline, or a narrative. And I think that's what appealed to a lot of people at that time. A lot of very educated people, and a lot of people that had the time and the wealth to engage in this. And so you had this huge explosion of games. One of the guys that designed for Avalon Hill, a guy named Jim Dunnigan, Jim's still alive in New York City. He started his own company in New York called Simulations Publications Incorporated, and started a strategy and tactics magazine. And they would actually, it was bi-monthly, and they would actually publish a game, a full
Yep.
board game, in every magazine.
Oh yeah.
That's neat.
Oh, that was so cool. And I got finally convinced my parents to subscribe to 1 year, six issues. And they'd come out with, I think, perhaps the best game, the issue before I subscribed, which is called the Panzergruppe Garderian, which was the battles on the way to Moscow. And it was a very highly rated game. We were playing it in the game club at my high school, and it was so cool. And my next I missed that issue, and my next issue of Strategy and Tactics came in the mail, and it was I think they had the run of the worst 6 games they ever published for my entire subscription. And then my parents wouldn't renew it because it was so expensive. Anyway, so you had that search for a narrative and search for being part of a part of that narrative to affect in some way that narrative. And in the midst of this, you had Gygax come up and
Well,
Dave Arneson also.
yeah, well, for Gygax, let's go to the Twin Cities gamers because this is where it really started, right? Wasn't with Gygax. It was, I would say the beginnings of role playing games really started with the Twin Cities guys. Major Dave Wesley, Dave Arneson, that group is where this idea. I think. Well, I think other people were kicking around the idea already. I don't think they were the first to do it, but I think that's where the evolution of the modern day role playing game really evolved from, right?
Well, real quick, Joe, did you ever play like Diplomacy, or had you heard of Bronstein at this time?
Yeah, Bronstein, no, but Diplomacy, yes. That was one of the really early games. It was and great for club because it was 7 players. You could play with 6, but 7. Well, the 7th player guy always got Italy, and Italy always sucked. But anyway, but still, yeah, never seen Italy win the game ever. But yeah, we did, and so that gave you you were the commander and negotiator, and there was a bit of role playing in that. There truly was, and of course the idea of backstabbing your best buddy. So yes, we did. Bronstein concept was something new. We had a couple of things. SPI published a game called Sniper, which was a man-to-man World War II game. And there wasn't much role playing in it, but it did have the idea of man-to-man, that whole level of the small unit skirmish, and but there was no between games. There wasn't any really continuity, and so it was just the story of that game that you were creating. And of course, what the Bronstein did is that eventually, as they figured out, well, we can go from game to game to game, and keep the narrative moving forward. And I don't think they did that the original ones that they did, but I think in some of the cowboy and Indian games that they actually if my memory is correct,
Yeah,
what I've
that's right.
heard, they actually took the narrative from one game to the next. So we done, the man-to-man concept was not foreign to us, but we didn't make that jump until D&D came out.
Yeah, and just to rewind, I'm going to rewind way back here to the 1800s and mention Kriegspiel because this is really the real first war game after, chess and Chinese checkers and all these variations thereof, because there were other variations. There was another game kind of like chess made around the Middle Ages that, there were different variations. But Kriegspiel was really the first war game. And I think that's really important because that's where the Twin Cities guys kind of got their ideas from. It came from out of Kriegspiel. Watching Kriegspiel, you had a referee, and it was a war game played on a real map. And you had your little, they used wooden blocks. I think it was in the first set. They actually, gave it to it was a military training tool um, for the Prussian army. And, out of that, Joe was talking earlier about a lot of these first war games were designed for the military, and that's where it came from was Kriegspiel, and the Prussian army took to it. And because of the Franco-Prussian War, they were so successful. All these other countries were like, well, maybe Prussia's onto this war games thing. So they started adopting their own versions. And here in America, this guy named Staunton had a game called Strategos. Was that what it's called, Joe?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
And the Twin Cities guys got their hands on that. They were playing miniatures games. And one of the core concepts, the real bridge here is the concept of the referee. And so these guys started playing Strategos, and they made their own Major Dave Wesley, who I credit as the real creator, well, accidentally the creator of the role-playing game. I don't think he, really, even to this day, I don't think he really takes credit for it, but I give him credit for it. He started doing this concept of the referee in the war game, which is still a very common thing if you play with any historical war gamers. Usually, there's always a referee. You don't have to have one, but we still had this concept in historical wargaming of the referee, and I think that's the real bridge between war games and role playing games because those guys they always had a referee, and all of a sudden people were like, "Well, we want to build a bridge across the river." And, Dave Wesley, who was usually the referee, was like, "Okay, well, sure, you can do that." Because if you don't have a referee, you have to squabble and bicker about these, and usually that's not gonna come up because you're sticking straight to the rules. But with a referee, you have a little bit more creativity, and Dave Wesley really encouraged this sort of thing. And so when he started doing the Bronstein, which was kind of an experiment, it was kind of the same thing, and they were doing this. It really was kind of probably a modern day LARP, really, is what they were playing, and it kind of escalated into their old wargaming kind of thing into a role playing kind of thing. And the first time he did it, I know he it kind of went out of control. He actually thought it was didn't go good, and then he realized after that night that hey, this everybody started approaching him like, "Hey, when are we gonna do another one of those Bronstein things?" And then they started doing others and experimenting with it. And that's when Dave Arneson took the idea and took it a little bit further. And then, one night, the rest is history. He created Blackmore Castle and, the Blackmore game, which those guys are still playing to this day. And he introduced that to Gary Gygax and his group. They played in the Blackmore game. And then, of course, Gary Gygax got a hold of it, and boom, you had Dungeons and Dragons. But I think that's the real bridge was the referee, right? That concept.
Yeah, I think that in the idea of a continuing narrative.
Mhm.
It's interesting that very first Bronstein that they did was actually from the Napoleonic miniatures game. They were doing
Yeah.
Napoleonic miniatures, and
Yep.
they just he had the idea of, hey, let's do like a skirmish thing beforehand. And I think the basis of it was that the French commander was at a house of ill repute, and
Right.
the British were to come in and try to capture him, and there was orders that needed to be captured, and people needed to be do various things. So it was really done as an adjunct, as a sub narrative to the miniature campaign that they were doing before a battle in order to
Right.
determine the beginning of a battle. And yeah, so you had the individual man to man with the referee, and the idea that the narrative was going to continue or to affect something else. And of course, that developed later on as the narrative going from game to game to game. And then you build this complete story out of the little individual narrative parts, and into you have your own tale that
Yeah.
that you're telling. Yeah.
Well, I think that was the other thing was see, initially, that first Bronstein game, there was only supposed to be 6 players, and then, the whole town shows up, and there's 30 players in Dave Wesley's, basement. You know? And so the concept was everybody was gonna play a role. And so he only had 6 roles made up, so he just started making up roles off the top of his head as people started walking down to the basement. At first it's like, "Okay, you're the commander of the French, you're the this Prussian militia leader, you're the mayor." Then all of a sudden he's like, you're a school teacher and you're a preacher." He just started making up these roles for everybody. And what started happening is initially he started bringing in everybody one at a time into the room, and he had a map and miniatures laid out, and he was like, "Okay, what do you want to do?" Blah blah blah. Well, the thing is, he had 30 players out there just hanging out, and of course, they started bullshitting amongst each other and swapping information. Before you know it, they were actually starting to role play. And this is, I think, this was a really important moment in role playing history and probably war game history too. Is when Dave Arneson, I think it was Dave Arneson, he insulted one of the other players. So they decided they want to get into a duel. So they walk into the other room while Dave Wesley is, doing and Dave Wesley has no idea this is going on. They walk into the other room and like, "Hey, he insulted me, and I can't, my honor says we need to have a duel." And so he's like, "How can we do a duel?" And Dave Wesley's like, "What? You guys have been playing the game out there without me?" They're like, "Yeah, we've been playing this whole time." And so I think that little moment right there where we want to have a duel, we're playing this character, I'm insulted, all of a sudden they're role playing, and that was probably I think that's a really important, just that little thing probably was one of the most important things in role playing history right there.
That is kind of where it all happened. If the story goes, if I recall, actually, David he gave up and went to bed that night. I think it was I think we were at college, and he was like, "Oh my God, this is out of control, and everybody's going to hate this." And they continued to play after he left.
Yeah, they did. I forgot about that. He thought it was a failure. He kind of gave up on it, and everybody was still playing down in his basement. They kept going. And then he got up the next morning and they're still going. They're still arguing and making deals and stuff. And he's like, "What the hell is going on?" And he thought it was a complete failure. Of course, he was in college at the time and he wasn't playing regularly. And so he went back to college. He was like, "Oh, well, that was a failure." But he started tinkering with it again. And then all of a sudden, when he got back, all the guys were like, "Hey, when are we going to do this next Bronstein?" He's like, "What? You want to do another one?" So, they did another one and they had different variations on them. I think one of the funniest ones was the Banana Republic. So they had this one. It was basically a fictional. Uh, it was basically Cuba. It was kind of a facsimile of Cuba, and everybody was playing different parts in this coup to take over the island. And Dave Arneson, he created this whole character. Everybody else kind of, they had a character set for him. And Dave Wesley's like, "Okay, you're going to play a CIA agent," and Dave Arneson was like, "Okay." Again, here we go back to Dave Arneson. And Dave Arneson actually like went all out. He created a fake ID. He had all these secret notes and all this stuff. And uh, they said, he had everybody fooled the whole time. But he went all out. I think he even like, if I remember right, he even dressed up the part. He had a suit on and like different glasses, and he had this fake CIA ID and actual pamphlets to hand out to people and all kinds of stuff. Um, so Dave Arneson, I think he really took it a step further in the whole the role playing aspect, and I think it really caught people off guard, but they liked it. They dug it and they kept going with it. And of course, they had many other Bronsteins after that, and Dave Wesley, I think, still runs Bronsteins for people, which someday I'd love to play in a Bronstein with him, or even maybe even do my own variation thereof. But yeah, Dave, I know you're really deep into the Bronstein history kind of bit and the beginnings and origins of D&D. Did you have anything to add to this conversation?
I mean, a little bit. So I was really interested from Joe. You had talked about several of the systems that you had, used throughout your time gaming. So I was just interested in your opinion of with these different systems where some you had liked, some you didn't. What made a system good to you?
Yeah, I think Joe stepped away for a minute.
Nope,
Uh,
I'm just back. So
Oh, okay.
sorry. Yeah, yeah. What made a system good to me? Um, yeah, it's kind of changed over the years. I think the when I first started out, um, pretty much everything was new and exciting, and so complexity in stuff didn't matter. In fact, the more complexity, the better. And sometime in there, I figured out that um, I wanted something that was more focused and less complex. And and then I realized later it's really the narrative that a game creates, be it a miniatures game, a role playing game, um, or a hex and chit a board game. And so, what I look for now in games is games that produce that narrative, that produce that story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, something that takes, each thing you do continues and affects things further on.
Well, and it's more than that. it's depending on what the game is based on is what is important to that game, and it concentrates on that. It's kind of hard to quantify. That's what's important to me now. It's cutting out the dross, or cutting out the pouring off the dross, so to speak, in what produces the actual narrative of the game, and kind of cutting the other stuff out. And that's what I look for now. That's what makes a game good for me now.
So do you prefer it then to be, more freeform then, kind of like, maybe the old Diplomacy or something, or do you still like there to be some sort of mechanical element to the, I don't know, maybe like the role play, such as maybe how OD&D had a simple reaction roll, or
I,
do you still like some sort of like number crunching and assignment during character creation, or just something
yeah,
different?
again, it depends on what the game is trying to do, and so you said diplomacy, and so diplomacy, the idea there is role play. Another more modern game, perhaps that people have played is Junta. I don't know if you guys have ever played Junta or not. If you haven't, it's a hoot of a game. And the point of that game is, the mechanics are simple. But the role playing is the whether you're playing El Presidente in Junta, or you're playing the Prime Minister of England or King of England in Diplomacy, or Germany, or whatever. That's what's important. Now, if I'm doing a modern miniatures game, where you got M1 Abrams versus the T-64B Soviet tanks, then a bit more of crunch is needed in that, to further the narrative. So it really depends on what you're trying to do and what the game is trying to do. That and so what I look for is, I look for games that find the important piece. They have the mechanics that produce, that help to produce the narrative, and everything else is kind of superfluous.
If I could
Again,
piggyback off of what you're saying, like a little bit of an example is, we see in a lot of modern games, and this isn't my own thinking. I'm just regurgitating what I've read from other people, but it's just helping me to kind of get my thoughts together. Is they've talked about how you'll see in modern games a lot of unified mechanics. And when we look at some of the older games, and this piggybacks off of what you talked about using, OD&D or classic D&D along with chainmail, is like, so you've got a mechanic for man-to-man combat and overland adventure, and then you have a separate set of mechanics like chainmail for then, hey, we want to get into the crunch of a combat of mass armies, and so here's the rules for, amassing armies and having them combat each other. And it's interesting to read back. I'll drop a name of another gentleman I've been reading of from these days. Is Rob Kuntz, who talks about, something he got from Dave Arneson. He had mentioned was staying away from unified mechanics and being able to have kind of like in his back pocket all sorts of different mechanics available depending on what he wants to do, and then knowing when to use each one, just as is right for his game or his group or whatever it is he's trying to tackle at any time. And it just, if I'm interpreting you right, it's almost, it seems to kind of fit well with what you're saying, where it just depends. The mechanics that you like or the system that you like, it just depends on what you're trying to do.
yeah, I think the best games are the games that cut away the stuff you don't need and keep the stuff that you do need, and allow you to focus on that, while everything else is kind of superfluous. And in miniatures games, I can give you some good examples. We play a horse and musket miniatures game. We do it everything, from all periods, from Napoleonic to Franco-Prussian War, called Volley and Bayonet. was lucky enough to help design the second version of it. And that game concentrates, it's very simple mechanics. And it concentrates on one specific level of warfare. And while the mechanics look simple, the narrative produced by the game is excellent. And it's a Frank Chadwick game. Frank was Game Designers Workshop, not Games Workshop, but GDW, which is a U.S. company.
Okay.
Which a lot of people probably have heard of. And Frank has the knack as a game designer of getting to what is very important about what you're trying to do. And he designs the game around that. So the Volley and Bayonet rules are excellent rules for generating horse and musket battles. In some ways, I think the original D&D, it does that too in some ways. There's not a lot of it, especially when you compare it to third edition. Third edition tried to unify everything with a unified mechanic, and when I first got into it, I was like, "Oh, this is cool! Everything works the same way, and everything it makes." It has internal consistency and logic, and that was like, wow, this is really important. And then I was like, oh my god, you can't play this. I mean, you can, but it's almost too much to play. I would rather play OD&D, which, even though it didn't have a unified mechanic, was in some ways more simple.
I concur.
Yeah,
with
third
that.
edition really got
Yeah,
a
I
really
mean,
bad power creep after you got past the first couple levels.
yeah, around level 5. I mean, oh my god, and then trying to DM it beyond that was a nightmare. Coming up with with any kind of NPC, because I mean it was so complicated. So in board games, you kind of have the same thing. You can have these massive board games that that are almost unplayable. And if you do play them, it's like work. But you can also have some really large ones that have the mechanics that are important, and play very, very well, and produce a really good narrative and are fun to play. So that's what I look for. I look for someone who's able to a designer who's able to cut and cut to the chase of what's important.
Yeah, so I didn't mention that Joe, you have had your hands in kind of playtesting, creating, writing games. Tell us a little bit about what you've had your hands in.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to at NashCon years ago to meet Frank Chadwick and Greg Novak of Game Designer Workshop, and they came.
Yeah.
And got to be friends with them, and in the Volley and Bayonet rule set. Really liked. I helped kind of play test it, the original one. They were doing playtest versions. I played one of the games and told them I really liked it, and got to know Greg Novak, who's passed away. He passed away a number of years ago, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And the internet was just becoming a thing. In fact, it was kind of pre-internet at the time. It was, I think, AOL, or maybe even another service that had a chat board. Frank was on there, and so we started up a group, a Volley and Bayonet group, and with Frank and Greg. And as time went on, I was very involved in that, and they asked me to help playtest the second edition of Volley and Bayonet, and so I did. Wrote up a whole bunch of stuff, and we played a bunch of games here at the club, and got my name in the rule book as one of the playtesters and researchers for that, and that was very cool. At that time, because of the internet, I was able to reach out. I reached out across into England to Phil Barker, who wrote the Wargames research group, the WRG Ancients rules, and started up some conversations with him, and he got to know him a little bit, and helped him play test various rule sets that he's done, and then I ended up being one of the main play testers for the De Bellis Antiquitatis rules, which is a fast play set of ancient rules, making a very small game. It's not a large game, but a very small game, plays in about an hour. And it's very popular in England and here, and has been for the last, I don't know, 20 years or so. And I was one of the principals for bringing out the third edition. And
Yeah, I do want to mention that DBA, I think, for those that are listening that want to get into war games, don't really know where to start, and if you're interested in ancients or medievals, DBA is a really, really good option because you don't need a whole lot of figures to get started. It's pretty cheap because you could do it in any scale, and 15 millimeters the most popular, and it's fairly reasonable in price, and it's a really fun, easy, and fast playing game. So I just wanted to say that if because I know we get a lot of role players listening, and maybe they're from our conversation, they're like, oh, I want to get into miniature gaming. Well, if you want to get into historical miniature gaming, and you like medievals and ancients, I couldn't recommend DBA enough. And for the horse and musket period, volley and bayonet, hands down. Really good, easy rule set. Again, you can do it in any scale. Base sizes do matter, but you could scale it up or down. So you again, you could kind of do it on a budget. But I just wanted to mention that those two games are a really good introduction to historical miniature gaming if you're looking to get into it.
yeah, the DBA is excellent. Again, the DBA stands for De Bellis Antiquitatis, which is the War of the Ancients, in Latin or pseudo. I'm sure the Latin's correct. It's probably not pseudo Latin. It's probably real Latin. So, um, it's an excellent set, and it is played worldwide. There's a great community on the internet for it. You can buy pre-done armies. You can buy pre-painted armies if you don't want to paint your own. eBay has a bunch of them, and it's really good, and a really good experience with that group of producing DBA 3. And really good experience with Volume Bayonet. I also did some work on the Command Decision, which was Frank Chadwick's and the Game Designers Workshop World War II rules and their modern rules. They had a magazine. I wrote a couple of articles for that magazine, which got published. And not hard because they take anything that you sent them, and they were happy to get it. After the DBA experience, I was asked to write some articles for various wargaming magazines. There's one out of Spain, War Games and Soldiers, and got published there. Well, they actually asked me to write. They actually asked me to write the articles that got published. Well, Joe, would you write us this article? So yeah, it was really hard trying to get published with them.
Right.
So did that, and then I was still really much in the DBA mode, and I decided I wanted to write a book of historical battles using the DBA rule system. And I got together with about 6 other guys, and we produced a book, which you can. It's Great Battles of History for DBA 3. You can find it at you can find it on lulu.com, and their various war game shops sell it. So it's a self-published book by me, and but
I'll post a link.
Yeah, yeah, it'd be great. So I've done that. So I've gotten a couple of things published over the years. I won the editors for Editor's Choice Article Award for last year for Slingshot Magazine, which is a British. This is British Society of Ancients. And got published there on an article on DBA and the development of it, and some changes that I thought might need to be done to it. And that leads me to what's going on today. My current project is writing a role-playing game. And
yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
The whole I mentioned Melee Wizard, the Fantasy Trip, the Steve Jackson games back from the late 70s. Those always have held my I've always held them in really high regard. And
Yeah.
when that kind of blew up and got Steve Jackson lost his rights to them, the guy who owned Metagaming went out of business and refused to sell the rights back to Steve Jackson for those games. Steve Jackson developed GURPS, and GURPS never really appealed to me. So I always wanted to play the Melee Wizard. It was kind of like D&D light, and it had kind of its own charms. And about, I don't know, 12 years ago, 10 years ago, I don't remember how I found it, but I found this website called darkcitygames.com. And
Yep.
these guys had basically published a redo of the Melee Wizard, the Fantasy Trip game system, along with pre-programmed adventures. And they were like 12, 13 bucks. Still, they're $12.95 still. And so I was like, oh, I'll order one of these, see what it's like. Well, I got it. I was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And so
Yeah.
I bought every single thing. They have fantasy, and they have cowboy and Indian, and they have Western adventures, and they have sci-fi adventures. And so this was awesome. And of course, it's kind of a stripped down version, and so I started adding rules to it, as I always do, and kind of changing things around. And I wrote to them and I said, hey guys, I have some ideas. How about if we come out with an advanced version of your rules? And they were like, well, okay, send us what you got and we'll take a look at it. We're not really interested in that right now, but maybe we will be. And so I sent it to them, and I got this reply back saying, yeah, this ain't gonna fly. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, well, why? It was, well, there's stuff going on. I was like, okay, stuff going on. Basically, it's a nicer reply than that. And then about 2 months later, Steve Jackson, reacquires the rights to the Fantasy Melee Wizard and the Fantasy Trip. And I was like, oh gosh, is he's gonna put all these other guys out of business? Is what he's going to do? And then so there's no way this is ever going to work. And he didn't, which is great. They're still in business, and I think they're partnering with him now, or doing some stuff, which is great. But at the time, it was very tenuous. Their hold on their business was very, they just weren't sure. And
Right.
so I was like, okay, well, it just wouldn't go away in my mind. And so I said, okay, I'm going to morph this a little bit into something that's not going to be IP right infringement, and I'm just going to publish the stupid thing on my own, because I couldn't put it out of my mind. And so I've written it. I rewrote what I sent them, and have changed some of the mechanics in order to make it, where hopefully I'm not infringing anybody else's intellectual property. And anyway, so that's what I'm working on now, and I'm perhaps halfway through it. And anyway, if anybody's interested in it, I'll send you a free copy. It's for whatever it is, and you guys can play test it if you want and give me your feedback. But it's typical stats, 3 to 18, roll equal to or under to accomplish a task, and so that's my current project that I'm working on. So anyway.
Yeah. So you're looking at, are you going to look to get it published? Are you going to publish it
I
yourself?
probably will publish it myself. I've got On Military Matters, which is a bookstore / game store, mail order bookstore game store. Has they've kind of talked to me about it, but I'm probably just going to do it myself. And it's definitely a it's just a my own project for my own purposes. But anyway, that's anyway. We'll see how it turns out. We're playing it now on Tuesday nights. Over the Roll20 computer system, so, or software system.
Yeah, I've taken a look at your playtest rules that you sent me. It looked really interesting, definitely up my alley. I've been meaning to playtest it with my group, and we probably
That'd be
will
cool.
here. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to check it
Yeah,
out. So yeah, Cody,
I'll send you
definitely.
guys a copy. Yeah, it's no problem. Just it is not It is not finished, and it is not particularly well proofread right now. So you'll have to the really bad grammar and spelling mistakes and whatnot. You'll have to overlook. It'll have to go through a lot of polishing, but it's fairly well along. Um, like I said, I'm about half done with it, at least with the text in the game system itself.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So, Chase, did
Well,
you
I
have
was just
something?
going to mention you mentioned that you had you're running that over Roll20. Are there any particular systems that you're doing any kind of miniature gaming with right now with the social distancing?
We've looked at a couple of things, and Cody, I think you've looked at some things also.
Oh yeah,
Um,
tabletop
yeah,
simulator.
tabletop simulators one. The what has got me right now is that we needed something fairly quickly when this came up, and so I decided that, hey, I'm going to take a look at the Roll20 and doing this game on the Roll20. And it ended up being have a little bit more of a learning curve than I thought it would, and so I've spent really a lot of my time doing that and not looking at the tabletop simulator. I would like to do that though, because I would like to be able to play miniatures games again. Um,
Oh man, it's awesome. I'm telling you. Me and Dave actually played. Well, I've played a few miniature games with people on there and some role playing games. But man, for miniature games, I think it's probably the best tool for if you wanted to play a real miniature game,
It was
online.
great. We did
Yeah,
chainmail on there.
yeah, we
oh,
did
that's
chainmail. I've
cool.
played some old
That's very
school.
cool.
Yeah, we played some old school 40K. In fact, I have a chainmail campaign that I've been working on, and I'm hoping that Dave will be uh, my accomplice in this, and we can actually stream it sometime.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I remember, God, it's probably 12 years ago. Some of the game stores I would frequent, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to participate, but they had campaigns for 40K. So it kind of went with a tiered system, and then it was based off of one guy and his army was kind of like the main big bad, and then they tried to tell this story with everybody's armies. It looked really cool the way they had it set up.
Oh yeah, campaigns are a lot of fun with war games, and Joe and me and the Trek and Hole guys have done a lot of them that have turned out really good. I think my favorite ones. Joe runs this really well. He's run real lot of really good campaigns. I think my favorite two he's run is he does a 1066 DBA campaign, which is really awesome. And the great thing about it is you can actually play it. You can play a whole campaign in one day with DBA because it takes 30, 45 minutes to play a game. And so it's the whole 1066, and it's just a blast. And then the other fun one, really good one is he does Cold War Gone Hot, and everybody takes a Russian regiment, and you're all
Division,
trying.
actually, yeah,
It's
yeah, division,
division,
yeah.
yeah, it's a division, and you're all trying to race to the Rhine. So you're all on the same side. You're all playing Russians, but the opposing team will play the NATO forces,
Right.
and they'll randomly roll up what you got to fight. And if you win the battle, depending on how well you win, you advance a little further towards the Rhine. So it's still kind of this competitive thing. We split up into teams and we do this. I think we've done that.
Twice now.
Maybe
Twice now. Yeah, we
yeah,
finished
twice. And
completely twice. Yeah, that was a hoot. That was the yeah. That is it's not my idea. It's a guy named Martin Rapier out of England who came up with it, and it's quite brilliant because you have, because we split into three teams. You have the team whose night it is to play, and then whoever else shows up on the other teams plays NATO against them, and we keep track of the casualties in the division. It's a platoon. Every miniature is a platoon, and so it's not super oversized. The games are basically a regiment versus a reinforced NATO battalion, and so the because it's at least, I guess, 6 jumps or 5 jumps. You got to win 5 times to get to the Rhine. Unless you win really big, sometimes you can go up 2 spaces. But you keep casualties, and so depending on how hard you go and how much casualties you take, when you finally get to the Rhine, you can have nothing left to get across.
yeah, Yeah.
And
It could be pretty
and
brutal.
it also doesn't matter because not everybody has to show up. You got to have the team who's playing that night show up, but whoever else shows up from the other teams, they play the opposition. So the people mechanics of it, it's really easy to keep it going, and it is a heck of a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's a blast, and I'm sure we're gonna do it again. I can't wait till we do it again. Um, yeah, but we've done a lot of campaigns. We just recently wrapped up a Civil War campaign. I don't did we finish that one? I think it kind of
Yeah, the
teetered out because of
the the
yeah.
the COVID's shutdown got us, but it's basically over. We're doing a Stonewall in the Valley, which was the Stonewall's Valley campaign, and we're getting very very close to the end of that, and pretty much I think the Stonewall's going to win. The South's going to win. Cody managed to do an end run around the Union forces, and he's rampaging up into Virginia, Upper Virginia, and even into Pennsylvania now. So that one's about over with.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, but I love wargaming campaigns. They're just bring a whole new dimension to your war game. One thing I did want to touch on why I got Joe here because he's quite the expert on the war games is like I said we most of our I think most of our audience is role players. I kind of wanted to do this episode about war games because I think it's a really important part of our hobby, and it's sort of been forgotten I think by a lot of people and just historical gaming in general. I think is I don't know, Joe. Do you think it's a dead or dying hobby, historical wargaming?
Jury's out on that.
Yeah.
The For a while, I was a bit down
Mhm.
on that. You know the the gaming culture though has really bloomed in the last 10 years. You've had the resurgence
Yeah.
of D&D. You've
Yeah.
had the 40K and Warhammer Fantasy has really taken off. Um,
And board games.
War games have gone crazy. Now, a lot of them
Yeah.
are not war games or war game oriented, but a lot of them are. The whole Richard
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, not war games, board
No, no, no,
games.
no.
The
The
board
board
games,
games,
yeah,
a lot of them are not war games.
yeah.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
some of them are war games, like the Richard Borg
yeah.
series, all the stuff that
Mhm.
Borg did with Memoir 44 and Battle Cry, the renamed Battle Cry, which was his Civil War, all using the same system, and then and you see those around in the board gaming area, and so
Right,
that's kind of given me a little bit of heart that. That is coming back. I think what you had is I think that you had a lot of the hex and chit gamers all moved to computer games, and
right,
that
right,
kind of left um, a hole there, and so for a long time there weren't that many historical games that were not computer games that were being produced, and
right,
you didn't have the younger folks getting into it. The You can talk about societal changes, and everything else, but then again, you look around and Flames of War is huge or was huge and still pretty
yeah,
big, and so that gives me a bit of heart that the historical gaming is still out there. I think a lot of it moved to, like I said, to the computer, and I think that kind of hurt it in that you didn't get the new folks coming in and seeing these huge games and being impressed by them. It was all on computers, and you just didn't have the same. There wasn't the same amount of recruitment. I guess I don't know
right.
how to call it differently.
Well, it's definitely in the last, I'd say, really 5 years, miniature wargaming, especially has really had kind of a renaissance. You have more rule sets and more miniature companies and more access to that aspect of the hobby than you ever have. But it still seems to me it's mostly gray hairs playing historical games, unfortunately. And it's really unfortunate to me because I I I feel like it's a really important part of the hobby. It's a really fun hobby. It's something I love to do, and it's really unfortunate to me that it just doesn't seem to. It seems like it's a generational thing. It doesn't seem to appeal as much to the younger generation, and I don't really know why that is. But even though that you have all these, there's still a fan base out there. But again, it seems to me when I go to a historical convention like Historicon or local convention NashCon, it's usually a lot of gray hairs, and some younger people too, but mostly I'd say 80% gray hair. And that's unfortunate, I think. And do you think there's any way we can get the younger generation interested in historical gaming again?
Again, I think for a long time there was a lack of recruitment. I think things like Flames of War, and even 40K in Warhammer Fantasy, I think those are kind of what we need to focus on. I mean, if you're interested in the Warhammer Fantasy stuff, now it's called what's the new name for it? Age of Sigmar.
Age of
Yeah,
Sigmar,
yeah.
yeah.
Basically, that's the medieval gaming. It really truly is with magic on top and monsters, but still the base is there. And with Flames of War, World War II is always held, I think, in people's imagination. You've had in the last 20 years really good World War II movies that have come out, I think have captured some of the younger people's imagination. I think, again, the problem is that for 20 years or so, maybe even longer, when things were going to computer, the board and hex war games stopped, and the miniatures has always been a smaller piece of the hobby here in the States. And in England, it's not. It's much bigger in England.
Oh yeah.
So I think that was part of the problem. It is this it
Mhm.
wasn't out there. All the old Grognards were playing on the computers,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I think that a whole generation missed seeing the historical games. And also, I think in some ways, some people were not as interested in the history. One of the things that drove me um, when I was a kid was the whole NATO Warsaw Pact. I'm old, so that was a threat that was always in the background. Duck and cover from the big nuclear attack. Um, so there was always this tension there, and part of the thing is that I think was that the Russia was unknown, Soviet Union was unknown. There were all these unknowns, and so part of the fun of that was trying to figure out, what were the Ruskies up to, and how would it affect us today, and when the Soviet Union fell, that kind of all went away, and so you don't have that international tension that keeps people's attention anymore, that makes people
Right.
wonder. And that was part of the draw. And you'll notice if you go back and look at all the board and hex, the hex and shit war games, the strategy and tactics, the Nazi nukes in NATO. That was the famous thing. If you're going to make a game, you want it to be a hit, it had to be either about
Yeah.
have Nazis in it, have nukes in it, or have NATO in it. And that was really, really huge, and that was a huge draw for people. Is that who were the Russians? What were they up to? How would it play? What's going to happen in the future? Um,
Yeah.
and so when that went away, um, when that evaporated, when the wall fell, that was a big part of the draw that's just kind of gone. It just kind of disappeared. And the interesting now is that you'll see there's a bit of a renaissance in the old
Yeah.
1980s game, the NATO Warsaw Pact games. Now you're seeing a lot of them come out, both computer games
Yep.
and the traditional hex encounter games. Which is interesting. But I think that was a problem too, and so I think we kind of lost a whole generation. I mean, Cody, obviously you're different, and you are you from your dad is where you picked up probably a lot of your love of that. But I think a lot of kids haven't. And but the good thing is they've turned to the fantasy, they turned to the Games Workshop stuff, and so it's still out there. I think it just needs to be presented to them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, see, I think there's a couple factors here. For one, what you were saying, I think there's a generational gap because, your generation and back, you were surrounded by conflict and war. Your fathers, grandfathers were in World War II, your dads were in Vietnam, you had the Cold War going. So there was already this kind of I think every young boy growing up in your generation before automatically, was interested in warfare, and that kind of probably piqued everybody's all your generation's history interest in history and warfare and all that. But I think the other factor is I don't think a lot of younger people are aware that historical wargaming even exists. Because it's not extremely accessible, with a few exceptions. Like Flames of War obviously is great because it's in the hobby shop. You can walk into any hobby shop. It's there. You can pick it up and leave, and you're ready to go. But most historical games aren't like that, and I don't think people are really aware what's out there. So I think that's one thing that needs to be done. I think the historical community really needs to make more games in the model of Flames of War to attract the younger generation and get back to the roots of the hobby.
Yeah, I agree. There's also a bit of is there's really no clear leader anymore. Back in the 70s it was Avalon Hill and Simulations
Right.
Publications Incorporated. And my gosh, SPI, they advertised in Playboy magazine. I mean,
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
back Playboy at its height. And so not only was it on college campuses, not only did you have young professionals playing, but I mean you had that kind of exposure, national exposure, and it really played well to that demographic. And when SPI went under in the early '80s, of course, everybody knows the story there. Gygax actually bought the remnants of the company. TSR actually did, but they'd blown up long before then. Wasn't much left when he bought it. Um, that was pretty much over, and the big exposure of those games was over. They didn't have the money to advertise in Playboy magazine anymore, and
Right.
so all that kind of left them just kind of disappearing, and no one came up to take the mantle and push it forward.
Yeah, and I think that's what needs to happen now. I think, again, it's more accessible than it has been in the past. You have games like Bolt Action, Flames of War, and things like that are really accessible and easy to get into. But you don't have, like, say, a Civil War, American Civil War version of Flames of War, or a Napoleonics version of Flames of War, really. And I think that's what we need. We need games like that, that you can go into the hobby shop. There's the Battle of Waterloo, or part of the battle, whatever. And here's a rule set, and here's everything you need in a box. You pick it up at the hobby shop, bring it home, and boom, you're in. Because I do think that is a big contributing factor. I've talked to so many people because I still run. I'll go up to the game store. Well, I haven't done this in a while, but I used to go up there, once a month or whatever, and run basically demonstration games of historical games. And I'd have many people pass by and be like, "Oh wow, what is this? I've never seen anything like it." Because it's not Warhammer. They're just not exposed to it. And unless you are even aware of it, you're not going to look deeper into the hobby. So I think that's a big contributing factor to of it is. I think there is some hope for the younger generation, and I think we could rope some more in back into the roots. It's just the fact we need to make it more accessible. We need to bring it more into the open. And yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
But on a positive, yeah.
Yeah,
Anyways, on a
exposure is
positive
definitely a
note,
big
I
thing.
think it's it's still really healthy and strong right now, and it's more accessible and easy to get into than ever.
Yeah, and like I said, in like in England, you have the leader with Games Workshop, and they've done an
Right.
amazing job. It's an amazing company, and they've proved that it can be done. With the fantasy and with the sci-fi. You've got a slew of historical based movies and shows, whether it's the Cornwall's The Last Kingdom, which is
Yeah.
actually pretty good. Or well, you had of course the fantasy based Game of Thrones. Um, you've got a lot of that stuff out there right now to get people's attention and curiosity. Um, and we just don't have a leader now, at least in miniatures gaming or in the hex and board gaming, hex and chit board gaming, to really have the big hit that pushes it all forward and makes it strong again. And of course, you all have the computer thing. The computer thing is a big, in a lot of ways, it is a competitor.
It is, and it has been for a long time. Yeah, and that probably has a big part of it too. I think that has hurt the gaming industry for a long time. Is the computer games, but like we were talking about earlier, I'm starting to see kind of an upswing on going back to the traditional tabletop games. A lot of it looked like for a while there that the entire tabletop industry in the early 2000s, it was tanking, you know, because of the computer industry and book sales and everything in general were just tanking. But it seems like people are kind of coming back around to the idea of tabletop gaming. So
Well, I mean, physical media altogether has been in a much bigger upswing in
it
the last 5 years.
it is well. The other thing is, I think people are getting nostalgic too. And yeah, but people really dig physical media. I mean, when did you think that vinyl records would outsell CDs? Well, they are right now.
Oh, wow,
That's
that's amazing.
yeah. So that right there gives me a little hope, even though that's not really gaming related. It's still kind of the same thing. We're talking about a media platform that's really well to me. It's not outdated, because I still collect records, but and it's still superior. But that's another note. Um, you're talking about something that everybody considered outdated, old, no good anymore. Let's move on to this new medium. Well, real music lovers, and people that are the younger generation that's getting into being music lovers are deciding, well, we really dig this vinyl record. It's a lot better than digitally downloading something. You actually get like a big 12-inch record with a full color spread art and liner notes and all this stuff. Yeah, so people are comic books. Um, might be the same way. I don't know. The jury's still out on that one, but I think that more has to do with quality than anything. But yeah,
And another
yeah,
argument to be made along
that's a whole nother topic. We're not going to go into it tonight, but but yeah, so I think there's some hope there, and we're going on the 2 hour mark here, so I'd like to end on a really positive note. I think this is a good positive note to say is that tabletop gaming in general, I think the future is really bright, and it seems like people are really going back, to the traditional tabletop. They've really just, I think a younger generation has rediscovered this love of getting around a table, drinking some beers or what have you, and bullshitting with your friends and having a good time. Nothing's really ever going to compare to that. A computer game can't do that, but tabletop games can, whether it be role playing game or a board game or whatever,
It's a
right?
sense of community, and I think that people have started to miss that. I mean, how isolated. Well, in this current pandemic that we have going on, I think everybody feels isolated.
Yeah.
But I think and that's one of the things that I love about gaming in general. Not only is the story and the narrative, but it's a narrative that's a shared narrative amongst your friends, and so you have a peer group. You become part of a group, and there's a shared experience And you don't get that on a computer game. You can some if if you play on a server with your buds, but it's just not like
Yeah.
being together. I find it interesting. My own son, who's a big computer gamer, what they do is they get all their Xboxes together, and they'll go to someone's house.
Oh yeah.
And they all play.
Mhm.
They all play together in the same room, and I'm like, well,
LAN party.
yeah. And so I'm like going, well, guys, I mean, you can just plug in and put your headset on, and of course, it's not the same. You're there
Yeah.
with your buds playing, and so that's the great thing about either role playing games or your traditional war games or miniatures games. There is a sense of community and people getting together, and you get rid of this kind of isolated. And I do think modern society is very isolated and very segmented, and that helps to bring people together. And I'm hoping that's part of the thing too, is people get tired of, well, I don't want to sit in front of my TV and watch Netflix all night. I want to go out and be part of a story, help create a story, and with my friends. And I think that is something that may drive people back together to be part of a community, to be part of a group of friends and having fun. And you don't get that. You just don't get that as much on the computer.
No, you don't. And with that, I think that's a great positive way to close out the evening. Um, Joe, it's been great having you on. Thank you for joining
Thanks,
us.
Cody. It was great. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope you're always welcome to come on again. We were talking about Games Workshop. I actually have an episode in the works talking about Games Workshop and Oldhammer, and I think you'd probably enjoy being on that one because I know, like me, you're an old Games Workshop
Yes.
player, and so we're going to have a conversation with that, and I'm going to have some other Oldhammer guys on here. We're going to discuss that. But yeah, this has been a great conversation. Chase, Dave, Joe, uh, thanks for the great talk tonight. Does anybody have any closing statements before we close out the evening?
I'm good.
All right. Well, on that note, this has been the Grognard Gamers. Um, yes, we still will be streaming games. I'm probably not going to stream the Dark Sun game anymore, um, just because we've had so many technical issues with it. But I've kind of worked out the kinks. So we are in the works of working on another live stream game that will be much better now that we've worked out all the technical kinks. So look forward to that. And just a preview for next week. Next week we will have the Bards of Greyhawk joining us. They
Right.
are a great Dungeons and Dragons themed, I guess you would call it folk rock kind of band.
Cool.
They're really yeah, they're really excellent. If you haven't checked them out, go check them out. But we will have the Bards of Greyhawk on here next week talking about their band and discussing gaming. They're a hilarious group of guys. They're really funny and really entertaining. So it should be a really fun episode. Really lighthearted and good. But anyways, this has been the Grognard Gamers. Everybody have a good night.
Good night.